All right, I think we'll start. So good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us. We're going to be running through our second webinar leading up to our implementation of our new ballast water management regulations starting in January. Before we start, just wanted to run through a quick housekeeping issues. First, my name is Chris Shiani. I'm the program manager for California's Marine Invasive Species Program, and I'll be giving the presentation today. But I'll have some help from Lina Ceballos Osuna, who's a senior environmental scientist with our program. So if you don't know Lina already, she is the one who led the development of these regulations and processed it through the rulemaking process here in California. So she'll be a good resource for us today and resource for you later on if you have questions over the next coming days or weeks, as well anyone from our team. So please feel free to reach out to us. A quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and our intention is to put it on our website within a few days after, probably by the early to mid next week. Please mute your microphone and turn off your camera. And we're going to do what we did last time and use idea boards to collect questions and comments. So if you haven't used idea boards before, Lina, would you mind putting the link into the chat if you haven't done that already?
I just did it. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So here's the idea boards. If you use that link, you'll see this, and the way we split it up is, and Lina will probably have to keep putting that link up there for new people that join. We split it up between the two webinars, so all of these pink sticky notes were from the previous webinar. The right side, if you have any questions or comments during today's webinar, please use this side, and the way to use this is you hit this green plus and it adds a sticky note, and if you click in it, you can type in a test question and it'll be there. And the more questions people ask, we'll just have more and more sticky notes. It's useful for us because you'll see later, but we intend to take all these questions and put together a frequently asked question document so that we can have answers to these questions available to people that aren't here or able to watch the video. One additional benefit of this is it allows us to see how popular certain questions are. So if you're coming to this and you have a question you want to ask, but you see that it's already been asked, you can select it and give it a thumbs up and it'll add these numbers to it. So it'll continue adding. So we'll be able to see which questions have the most interest. And that could help us when, if we need to narrow down the questions at the end due to time, or when we're preparing our frequently asked question document. So that's that. If you have any questions about it or have any difficulties, you can use the chat in Teams, but we do want to use this platform for collecting questions for later on. Okay, and I think with that, we can just move on into the presentation. So we're gonna, if you were here for the previous presentation, the previous webinar, our plan is to use almost the same PowerPoint, but we've also inserted some of those sticky notes that the questions from the last webinar into this presentation at the appropriate time, so we can touch on those items that you brought up at the last meeting. So quickly, some background to California's new ballast water requirements. Just to touch on the purpose of the Marine Invasive Species Program here, our goal is to reduce the likelihood of non-indigenous species being discharged into state waters through the actions of shipping actions, primarily ballast water and biofouling. And we do that by regulating the management of those two mechanisms. We do have existing ballast water management requirements that we've been enforcing for many years. Those are primarily require the use of ballast water exchange at different distances depending on where the vessel is coming from. And those will continue to be in existence for the vessels that are not yet subject to the performance standards that we'll talk about. For the third bullet, we in California have had interim and final performance standards in regulation for many years with future implementation dates. And before each of those implementation dates, we have had to produce reports to the legislature outlining the efficacy and availability of ballast water treatment systems to meet those interim and final standards. And the most recent report in 2018, our take-home point was that there were no technologies available to meet the California interim standard. And as a result, the legislature passed Assembly Bill 912 in 2019. And through this Assembly Bill, the legislature amended our Marine Invasive Species Act. They gave us a mandate to implement the existing federal ballast water discharge performance standards and the implementation schedule, the federal implementation schedule. And it would also delay California's interim and final ballast water discharge performance standards that were set to go into effect. The interim standards were set to go into effect. So real quickly, and we'll go into more details in a bit, but the new regulations and the new statutory language, again, requires us to implement the federal ballast water discharge performance standards in the schedule. It authorizes us, the commission, to collect ballast water samples for research and compliance. It requires monitoring the use of the ballast water treatment system. So there are monitoring and record keeping requirements for vessels that are going to be operating in California. And there are a few alternative options there for vessels as well. So some of the first questions we got, the biggest questions we got during the last webinar were about the federal ballast water discharge performance standards and what are they? And there were questions about whether they were equivalent to the 2013 VGP, or if they're similar or different from the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act, or if they would change because of the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act. And the short answer is that these are independent of VITA and the Vessel General Permit. They implement the existing US Coast Guard enforced requirements that are found in the Code of Federal Regulations of 33 CFR 151.2030. Those are the ballast water discharge standards. And then 33 CFR 151.2035. That's the implementation schedule that we have implemented as well. So just to be clear on that. And everyone is probably very familiar with this, but these are the performance standards broken up by organism size class. And I don't think I need to go into too much detail, but I'll just run through them really quickly. The organism size classes are organisms that are greater than or equal to 50 micrometers in minimum dimension. So that's the larger size class. The smaller size class are organisms that are less than 50 micrometers and greater than or equal to 10 micrometers, so between 10 and 50 essentially. And then indicator microorganisms like E. coli, intestinal enterococci, and toxicogenic Vibrio cholerae. And then on the right-hand column are the performance standards, the thresholds that are allowable for discharge for those different classes of organisms. So we also got a lot of questions last time about the use of alternative management systems during and after the original or the extended compliance date. So I won't read all of these, but essentially they're asking the same thing about how we would treat a vessel that has had their extended compliance date expire, where the Coast Guard would allow them to continue using their alternative management system for 5 years after that compliance date. And this is the chart that the table that we had put up at the last meeting, and I'll go through it again, but just to note that we added that highlighted bit at the bottom right there that the vessel may use an AMS that was installed prior to the original or extended compliance date for 5 years after the original or extended compliance date, and that's in alignment with the Coast Guard policy. So here we separated the table by whether the vessel's compliance date has not passed yet or has already passed. So if on the left side, the vessel is still within its compliance date is in the future, its extended compliance date is in the future. The requirement is the same as it always has been here in California. They can retain the ballast water They can exchange the ballast water at an appropriate distance from land. They can use an approved alternative, such as an AMS. They may request an alternative under extraordinary circumstances. They can request an alternative to use public water source, or they can discharge to an approved reception facility. So all that remains for any vessels that have not yet passed their compliance date. If the vessel has passed its original or extended compliance date, if they are discharging in California waters, then they would be required to meet the federal ballast water discharge standards. Under most situations, they can use a public water source. They can request an alternative if the vessel's ballast water management system is malfunctioning. And then this new bit that we didn't highlight last time, that was the source of a lot of these questions, was that yes, the vessels can continue to use their AMS to meet our requirements for 5 years after their compliance date expires. We got a question about the use of public water source. And the question essentially was asking if public water source was from anywhere or just in the US. And the short answer is it doesn't have to be from the US, but it has to meet the definition of public water source. That doesn't have a location in the definition, but there's a specific definition of what would meet the criteria for being a public water system, and that's in Title 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations, at the citation here, section 141.2. And so we incorporated that citation by reference. And so as long as the public water source meets the requirements of that definition, then it would be allowable for use here in California. There were questions about the process for contacting the commission to ask for an alternative if the ballast water treatment system is not operating properly. And essentially the existing requirement to contact the captain of the port for the U.S. Coast Guard, the idea is that at the same time they would be contacting us at our BW form at slc.ca.gov to let us know that there was also a malfunction. And we will coordinate with the U.S. Coast Guard, the local Coast Guard, at the captain of the port, and issue a directive that's aligned with what the Coast Guard would be issuing as well. So that's the new requirement for us, is to notify us in advance, and then we will give an alternative to ensure that the vessel can operate safely. There were questions about our enforcement. Will California issue violations or penalties for vessels found to be non-compliant with the ballast water discharge performance standards? And there were a series of questions that were related to that. Essentially, we have existing enforcement regulations that lay out a transparent path for how we would issue penalties for non-compliance. But the existing enforcement regulations don't yet have these new ballast water performance standards regulations built into them. So we're in the process of developing those amendments, and our idea is that we would be releasing that for public comment and starting the rulemaking action early next year. And so until those regulations are adopted, we would be in the position where we could cite violations like we typically do if we note that a vessel is in violation, but our ability to pursue penalties, it would be limited at that point. So it gives us a bit of time to work with the industry to make sure that any early non-compliance is corrected and addressed before we get to that position where we're going to be issuing penalties. The current enforcement regulations can be found on our website, and if you need any assistance finding any of that, just let us know and we'll be happy to point you to the correct spot. And there was a question about whether our actions are aligned with IMO, and again, because the US is not a signatory to the Ballast Water Management Convention, that our actions here are going to be independent of the IMO. There were questions about inspecting and assessing compliance and what our plan is for that. And there were questions about the different types of equipment that we might use, or how frequently we would sample, or what would be triggers for sampling. And overall, we still have the existing mandate to inspect 25% of the arrivals to California. So we will continue to meet that mandate and conduct inspections. There are different components of the regulations that we'll touch on in a few slides. Some of those are independent of sampling and analysis, and some of them would be dependent on sampling and analysis. And those protocols are still under development and testing, the sampling, collection, and analysis protocols. Most of what we'll be talking about the next few slides are specific to the other requirements, the reporting and record keeping requirements that are aligned with the proper use of a ballast water treatment system, if that's the mechanism that the vessel is using to comply with the regulations. There were questions about what potential triggers would be for sample and analysis, and there were some examples that the questioner listed there: a poor ballast water management plan or a lack of reporting. And the answer is yes, any indicator that the treatment system may not be operating as expected, and it could be that the system is being used outside of the system design limitations, there's no record of training, the management plan is poor, anything that would lead to a potential for the system not to be operated or be operating as expected, then that would be a trigger for us to move on to the next phase of an inspection. And then there was a question about the number of vessels that have failed samples, and we don't have records at this moment of vessels that have successfully been sampled or have failed sampling. We have a research contract going on right now with a contractor that is sampling vessels and at the end of and assessing potential compliance. And at the end of that project, there will be a public report and a published report for that, so that would be available at that time. There were some other general questions. What we would need from a vessel when she enters California for the first time next year. And we'll get into that in the next couple of slides, but essentially the existing requirements, reporting, record keeping, and management, or the new requirements related to those three would all need to be accounted for when the vessel comes into California starting next January. And those, like I said, we'll get into that in the next couple of slides. And there was a question about a frequently asked question document and whether we would be producing that, because that would be helpful. And the answer is yes, that our intention is to follow through with that, to put some of these questions that we're getting from both of these webinars into a document with answers that could be helpful for people that would want to view it and that may not be able to make this webinar. More general questions. There was a question about where can a vessel find their system design limitations for the ballast water treatment system they're using, and those system design limitations can be found on the type approval certificates that are issued by the Coast Guard. So that each of those type approval certificates will have limitations placed on that technology. Do the companies or vessels have to take any actions to update the ballast management plan or internal procedures when they call on California ports? And of course, they'll have to comply with the new record keeping requirements and the functionality monitoring requirements that we'll talk about on the next few slides. So this kind of lists some of the items that would need to be recorded and kept on board so that they are made available to our inspectors when they board the vessel during an inspection. So for the material safety data sheets, or the safety data sheets for the ballast water treatment system chemicals, if any, those must be maintained on board the vessel. Any technical guides, publications, and manuals related to the treatment system must be maintained on board the vessel as well. And then for the performance info, the date, the time, and the location of when the system was used, any system malfunctions, and the scheduled and unscheduled maintenance information must also be maintained on board the vessel. Any functionality monitoring that the system is doing, that's a part of the system's operation, whether it's recorded by the system itself or it's recorded by the crew, would have to be kept for 2 years. Any calibration activities would also have to be kept for 2 years, either printed or electronically, and made available to us if we ask for it during an inspection. We don't, for biological monitoring, we don't require biological monitoring to be done. However, if it is done, then there's a requirement to keep those records on board, either printed or electronically, and to make those available if we ask for them during an inspection. The vessel's ballast water treatment system type approval certificate, if applicable, must be maintained on board the vessel as well. And any procedures for equipment malfunction must also be maintained on board the vessel. And that's the extent of the presentation. Again, that was essentially the presentation that we gave a month ago with some of those earlier questions integrated into them. So now I'm going to go to the idea boards, and I don't see any questions.
Yes, Chris, you have to refresh. There are a couple of questions.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Okay, great. So this test one we're going to skip. So vessels need to request to use public water source as a compliance option prior to their compliance date. So I'll go, this is the text of the regulations. So section 2296 of the regulations allows for the use of public water system, and it doesn't require that you request an alternative. So essentially, if the public water system that is selected meets these criteria, if the vessel has records for of where that water was sourced, either a receipt or any sort of record to show that the water was sourced from a certain vendor. And if those tanks had previously held any ambient water, any ocean, lake, river water, then they would have had to clean the tanks prior to taking on the public water system water. So as long as those requirements are met, there's no need to request an alternative. The alternative is already a part of the regulations. The next question asks, can vessels wishing to use a public water system that may not meet the exact definition of 40 CFR request to use that PWS as an alternative compliance measure? Unfortunately, that is the statute that directed us to develop and adopt these regulations didn't include the authority to grant alternatives the way we typically have granted them for other requirements. So the answer in short is no, that wouldn't be something that we could legally give an alternative for. And if you do want to follow up on that later on, we can definitely do that. The next question is, will State Lands Commission be sharing any kind of risk analysis matrix used to determine which vessels will be subject to focus for inspections and sampling? Yeah, the prioritization, at least at the outset, is going to continue being vessels that are discharging water will be prioritized for sampling, whether they are required to meet these standards or not. We like I said, we have that mandate to sample 25% of the arriving vessels. And historically, throughout the 20-year history of our program, only about 15% of the arriving vessels are discharging. So that essentially means that we can target every discharging vessel, and our intention is to be on board and conduct an inspection of every discharging vessel, whether they're using a system to meet the performance standards, or whether they're using Exchange to meet the existing standards because they're still within their extension period. As certain records have to be maintained from January 1st, will vessels be expected to have 2 years previous to 1 January to 2022 on board? That's a great question. So go back to the text of the regulation. So there are these record keeping. So we can, this is one that we might have to follow up on, but I think the way that I'm reading it is that they would have, independent of let me think. I don't know. I don't want to say the wrong thing. This is one that we definitely will bring up in the frequently asked question document, and if this is the question that you are interested in, please put your name in the chat here and your contact information, and we'll reach out to you again once I get a better answer. I don't want to say the wrong thing. Okay. To clarify the first question, a chart on the slide said that vessels had to request to use PWS prior to compliance date. Okay, yes. For those vessels that, I'll bring this back up again. So vessels that have not exceeded their compliance date and they're operating under the existing requirements, then yes, they could still request an alternative to use public water system. But once the compliance date has passed, then that's, to meet those requirements, they can use a public water source that meets the definition. But then there is no other allowance for using for issuing other alternatives. We just don't have the authority to do that. So thank you for clarifying, and it does, that existing allowance is still there for the vessels whose compliance date has not passed. Where could I find a list of all ballast water treatment system types that are currently approved? The U.S. Coast Guard maintains a website that has a running list of all the type approved systems. Lena, would you be able to?
Deborah already kindly put the link to it in the chat.
Oh,
so
perfect. I was going to ask that. Thank you. And for the standards, what if VITA results in change to the CFR? Will California revise accordingly? And yes, definitely. The VITA clearly states that states cannot have standards that are more strict than those under VITA. And so if changes are needed, then we will make those changes here as well. I'm going to update it again. Okay, I think the one remaining one is this one, and said we'll reach back out to you to provide that answer, and we'll make sure to bring that up in the frequently asked question document. Lena, is there anything else from the chat?
no, I just copy the emails of the people interested in knowing the answer for the.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
all right, well,
emails.
Okay. I guess that's it. If you have any additional questions that come to mind, the beauty of this idea board is that it still lives after the close of the webinar. So if you do have a question, we'll be monitoring this. You can always come back to this and add another question. And if you do that, let us know, or you can email us the question and we'll respond back to you. But said we we want to keep the communication open, so let us know if you have any additional questions, and we'll be happy to answer. And yeah, well, we'll see where that goes. So thanks again for joining us, everybody, and have a good holiday season and a happy new year.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
No problem.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.